A picture-perfect baby shower for a millionaire's wife, bathed in the golden light of a Los Angeles afternoon. But beneath the shimmering surface of champagne flutes and pastel decorations, a devastating secret is about to detonate. What happens when a husband's ultimate betrayal is publicly broadcasted? And what if the one person who can save the mother-to-be from ruin isn't a friend or a family member, but the silent guest of honor no one saw coming? This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's a tale of a woman who was publicly shamed, and how she fought back. Stay tuned. The sun, a benevolent eye in the cerulean California sky, cast its golden approval upon the sprawling estate of David and Evelyn Hollander. From the manicured lawns that rolled like a verdant carpet to the infinity pool that mirrored the heavens, everything about the scene screamed perfect. It was the kind of perfection that graced the covers of magazines, the kind that fueled the aspirational dreams of millions. Today, this perfection was the backdrop for Evelyn's baby shower, a celebration of the impending arrival of their first child. Evelyn, with her cascade of honey blonde hair and a smile that could disarm armies, moved through the throng of guests with a practiced grace. Her dress, a bespoke creation of flowing silk that skimmed her 7-month baby bump, was the color of a summer dawn. She was the picture of radiant motherhood, the cherished wife of a self-made millionaire. David, ever the charismatic host, was never far from her side. He was a man carved from a different kind of marble than the old money that populated their social circle. His was the sharp, modern cut of a tech mogul, a man who had bent the world to his will with lines of code and a ruthless ambition. To the casual observer, they were a power couple, a testament to the new American dream. David, with his hand possessively on the small of Evelyn's back, would lean in and whisper something in her ear, and she would laugh, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. But for those who knew how to look, there were hairline cracks in this flawless facade, a flicker of something unreadable in Evelyn's eyes when David's grip tightened, a fleeting shadow that passed over her smile when he called her his everything in front of their guests. Their story was a modern-day fairy tale, or so the society pages had breathlessly reported. Evelyn, a former art curator, with a keen eye for beauty and a quiet strength, had met David at a gallery opening. He had been captivated by her intelligence and her serene presence, a stark contrast to the grasping, sycophantic women who usually orbited him. He pursued her with the same single-minded focus that had built his empire, showering her with gifts, whisking her away on private jets to exotic locales, and promising her a life beyond her wildest dreams. Evelyn, who had always been a romantic, had been swept off her feet. She had fallen in love with his drive, his sharp mind, and the vulnerability he showed her in their private moments. He had made her feel seen, cherished, and protected. When he had proposed on a yacht in the middle of the Aegean Sea, with a diamond the size of a small asteroid, she had believed their love story was destined for a happy ending. But the early days of their marriage had been a subtle, insidious chipping away at her independence. Her career, once her passion, was deemed unnecessary. "Why would you want to work, my love?" David had murmured, his voice a silken trap. "I want to give you the world. Let me take care of you." Her friends, the ones from her pre-David life, were gradually phased out, replaced by the wives of his business associates, women whose conversations revolved around designer labels and staff management. Her world had shrunk, its vibrant colors muted, until it was contained within the gilded cage of their palatial home. The pregnancy had been David's idea, a sudden, fervent desire for an heir. Evelyn, who had always wanted children, had been overjoyed. It was a chance, she had thought, to build something real with him, a bond that went deeper than his possessions and her compliance. She had thrown herself into the preparations, designing the nursery with the same meticulous care she had once given to curating an art exhibition. She had read every book on motherhood, attended every prenatal class, and dreamt of the day she would hold their child in her arms. But as her belly grew, so did a gnawing unease. David's initial excitement had morphed into a strange kind of detachment. He was obsessed with the idea of the baby, the Hollander heir, as he called it, but he seemed to have little interest in the reality of her pregnancy. He would talk about trust funds and boarding schools, but he would go silent when she spoke of her hopes and fears about childbirth. He saw the baby as a legacy, an extension of himself, and she, it seemed, was merely the vessel. The day of the baby shower, the sense of foreboding that had been a low hum in the back of her mind had amplified to a deafening roar. As she greeted the guests, a who's who of Los Angeles society, she felt like an actress playing a part. She smiled, she laughed, she accepted their well wishes, but a part of her was detached, watching the scene unfold from a great distance. Among the sea of familiar faces, there was one guest who stood out not for her celebrity or her wealth, but for her quiet, unobtrusive presence. Jessica Russo was not a friend in the traditional sense. She was Evelyn's lawyer, a woman she had sought out a few months prior in a moment of quiet desperation. The initial consultation had been about prenuptial agreements, a topic David had dismissed as unnecessary, but it had morphed into something more. Jessica had a sharp, incisive mind, and a way of seeing through the carefully constructed artifice of Evelyn's life. She had become a confidant, a lifeline to a world outside the gilded cage. Evelyn had invited Jessica to the baby shower on a whim, a small act of rebellion that had gone unnoticed by David. He had glanced at the guest list, his eyes skipping over the unfamiliar name, too preoccupied with ensuring the attendance of a particular venture capitalist to care about one of Evelyn's friends. Jessica had tried to decline, saying she would feel out of place, but Evelyn had insisted. "Please, Jessica," she had said, her voice uncharacteristically small. "I need you here." And so Jessica was here, a quiet observer, in a sea of performative happiness. She nursed a glass of sparkling water, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the way David's hand lingered on Evelyn's back, a gesture that was more about possession than affection. She saw the forced brightness of Evelyn's smile, the subtle tension in her shoulders, and she saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon of this picture-perfect day. The afternoon wore on, a blur of pastel-colored gifts, inane chatter, and saccharine sweet games. Evelyn, on autopilot, unwrapped tiny designer onesies and diamond-encrusted rattles, her smile feeling more and more like a mask that was slowly cracking. She could feel David's impatience growing, his jovial host persona wearing thin. He was a man who was used to being in control, and the slow, meandering pace of a baby shower was clearly grating on him. Finally, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the lawn, David clinked a champagne flute with a spoon, calling for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of the patio, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. Evelyn, seated in a large, throne-like chair, felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over her. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the grand finale to his carefully orchestrated performance. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice booming with a practiced charisma. "It means the world to Evelyn and me to have you here today, to celebrate this incredible new chapter in our lives. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, a king addressing his loyal subjects. Then his gaze fell on Evelyn, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was a look of cold, calculating triumph, a look that stripped away the years of carefully constructed affection and revealed the chilling truth that lay beneath. He raised his glass, the crystal catching the dying light of the sun. "To my beautiful wife," he said, his voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that made Evelyn's stomach churn. "The most incredible woman I have ever known." The guests murmured their approval, their faces a mixture of admiration and envy. But then the other shoe dropped, and the sound it made was a thunderclap that shattered the picture-perfect illusion into a million pieces. And to the perfect surrogate a man could ever ask for. He continued, his voice now laced with a cruel, dismissive tone. The smile remained on his face, but it was a different kind of smile, now a smirk of self-satisfaction. He had delivered the line with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly, a man so convinced of his own power that he didn't even bother to conceal his contempt. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the polite chatter and the tinkling of champagne flutes. The guests stared at David, their smiles frozen on their faces, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Had they heard him correctly? Had the millionaire mogul, the doting husband, just called his pregnant wife a surrogate? In front of all their friends and family, Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the carefully constructed facade of her life crumbling around her. She looked at David, her husband, the man she had loved, and saw a stranger, a monster, with a charming smile and a heart of ice. The word surrogate hung in the air, a poisoned dart that had found its mark. It was a word that stripped her of her identity, her love, her motherhood. It was a word that reduced her to a vessel, a means to an end. And then, as the first wave of shock began to recede, a new sound pierced the stunned silence. It was the sound of a chair being pushed back, a quiet, deliberate sound that drew all eyes to the woman who was now standing. It was Jessica Russo, her face a mask of cold fury. She had been the silent observer, the guest no one had paid any attention to. But now she was the guest of honor, the one person in this sea of sycophants and enablers who was not afraid to challenge the king in his castle. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on David, and in that moment Evelyn knew that the fairy tale was over. But a new story, a story of a fight for her child, for her dignity, and for her very soul, was just beginning. The word hung in the air, thick and venomous. Surrogate. It echoed in the cavernous silence that had fallen over the once joyful gathering. The guests, a veritable who's who of Los Angeles elite, were frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips' polite smiles, curdled into masks of confusion and dawning horror. They looked from David's smug, triumphant face to Evelyn's, which had gone as white as the gardenias adorning the tables. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Evelyn couldn't breathe. The world had narrowed to a single point, David's smiling face, the cruel twist of his lips. The man she had loved, the man she was building a family with, had just publicly, deliberately, and with chilling nonchalance, stripped her of her identity. She wasn't his wife, his partner, the mother of his child. She was a vessel, a transaction, a means to an end. The carefully constructed world she had inhabited, the gilded cage she had mistaken for a palace, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The whispers she had suppressed, the doubts she had brushed aside, the subtle cruelties she had rationalized. They all came rushing back, a tidal wave of agonizing clarity. The way he had dismissed her career, isolated her from her friends, controlled every aspect of her life. It hadn't been protection. It had been possession. He hadn't been building a life with her. He had been commissioning a service. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged wide-eyed, scandalized glances. This was a drama far more riveting than any Hollywood blockbuster. This was real. This was raw. And it was happening in the heart of their own curated, perfect world. David, oblivious, or perhaps reveling in the shockwave he had created, continued to smile. He had made his move, asserted his dominance. In his mind, the matter was settled. He had just informed his world that Evelyn was a temporary arrangement, a placeholder, until the real prize, his heir, arrived. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated Evelyn, and he had completely overlooked the quiet woman in the corner. As the collective gasp of the partygoers finally gave way to a cacophony of hushed whispers, Jessica Russo moved. There was no melodrama in her actions, just a cold, focused fury. She placed her glass of water on a nearby table, with a deliberate click, the sound cutting through the noise. Then she walked towards Evelyn. Her movement broke the spell. All eyes swiveled to her, this unknown woman who was now striding into the center of the storm. David's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Who was this woman to interrupt his grand pronouncement? Jessica reached Evelyn's side. She didn't touch her, didn't offer a comforting word. Instead, she stood beside her, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. She turned to face David, her gaze as sharp and unyielding as a shard of ice. "David," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the emotion that was roiling just beneath the surface of the crowd. "I believe you've had a momentary lapse in judgment. Perhaps you'd like to clarify your statement." The direct challenge, the utter lack of deference, stunned David into a momentary silence. He was not a man who was used to being questioned, especially not by a woman he didn't even know. He recovered quickly, his charm curdling into a sneer. "And who are you?" he demanded, his voice laced with contempt. "My name is Jessica Russo," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I am Evelyn's legal counsel." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the guests. "Lawyer." The word was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. This wasn't just a marital spat. This was a declaration of war. David's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, now contorted with rage. The carefully crafted persona of the charismatic tech mogul dissolved, revealing the ugly, petulant tyrant that lay beneath. "Her lawyer," he spat the words, dripping with venom. "What the hell is this, Evelyn? You brought a lawyer to your own baby shower." He turned on Evelyn, his eyes blazing with a fury that made several of the guests flinch. Evelyn, who had been frozen in a state of shock, felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. Jessica's presence, her quiet strength, was a lifeline in the swirling vortex of her emotions. She looked at David, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him not as the man she had loved, but as the monster he truly was. "Yes, David," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I did, because I had a feeling that the fairy tale was about to end." The crowd, which had been on the verge of dispersing, was now rooted to the spot, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. This was better than reality television. This was real-life drama unfolding in real time, and they had front-row seats. David took a step towards Evelyn, his hands clenched into fists. "You ungrateful bitch," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "After everything I've given you." Before he could take another step, Jessica moved, positioning herself between him and Evelyn. She was shorter than him, but she stood her ground, an immovable object in the face of his rage. "I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully, David," she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." The legal jargon, so out of place in the context of a baby shower, was a splash of cold water in David's face. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized it in Jessica's unblinking gaze. He was used to bulldozing his way through obstacles, but this woman was a different kind of adversary. She was not intimidated by his wealth or his temper. He scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "This is a private matter," he said, gesturing dismissively at the crowd. "Between my wife and me. You made it a public matter the moment you called her a surrogate in front of 200 people," Jessica retorted, her voice cutting through his bluster. "And as for her being your wife, we'll see what the courts have to say about that." The implication hung in the air, a threat so potent, it was almost a physical force. Divorce, lawsuits, the public airing of their dirty laundry. It was a nightmare scenario for a man like David, a man whose public image was as carefully curated as his art collection. He stared at Jessica, his mind racing. He had been so sure of his position, so confident in his power. He had believed that Evelyn, the quiet, compliant woman he had married, would simply accept her fate. He had never imagined she would have the audacity to fight back, let alone come armed with a lawyer. The party was over. The guests, sensing that the drama had reached a temporary impasse, began to make their excuses, their hushed whispers, following them as they fled the battlefield. The once joyful celebration had turned into a public spectacle, a cautionary tale that would be recounted in hushed tones at dinner parties for weeks to come. As the crowd thinned, Evelyn finally allowed the tears to fall. They were not tears of self-pity, but tears of rage, of grief, of a profound and soul-crushing betrayal. She had given this man her heart, her body, her future, and he had repaid her with a public humiliation so cruel, so calculated, that it had stolen the very air from her lungs. Jessica placed a comforting hand on her arm, her touch a small anchor in the storm. "It's okay, Evelyn," she said, her voice softening for the first time. "Let it out, and then we fight." Evelyn looked at Jessica, her vision blurred by tears. In the eyes of this woman she barely knew, she saw something she had not seen in a long time: hope. The road ahead would be long and arduous. She would have to fight a man with unlimited resources and a bottomless capacity for cruelty. But for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. The sun had set, and the once golden afternoon had given way to a twilight tinged with the promise of a long and bitter night. The fairy tale was dead, but in its ashes, a warrior was being born. Evelyn Hollander, the millionaire's wife, the perfect hostess, the radiant mother-to-be, was gone. In her place was a woman who had been pushed to the edge, a woman who had nothing left to lose. And she was ready to burn it all down. The silence that descended upon the patio after the last guest had fled was heavier than any sound. The remnants of the party half-eaten canapes, abandoned champagne flutes, and a mountain of pastel-wrapped gifts stood as a mocking testament to the shattered illusion of happiness. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, a reflection of the emotional carnage left in David's wake. Evelyn sat numbly in the throne-like chair, the silk of her dress feeling like a shroud. The tears had stopped, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a fragile shell of the woman she had been just an hour before. The word surrogate was a brand on her soul, a permanent scar that would forever alter the landscape of her life. David, who had been pacing the length of the patio like a caged animal, finally came to a stop in front of her. The mask of the charming host was gone, replaced by a sneer of undisguised contempt. "I hope you're happy, Evelyn." He spat the words, laced with a chilling venom. "You've managed to turn our private life into a public spectacle. Congratulations." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. The fear that had held her captive for so long had been burned away by the fire of his betrayal. All that remained was a cold, hard anger. "Our private life," she repeated, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "There is nothing private about what you did, David. You stood up in front of everyone we know, and you tried to erase me. You tried to turn me into a non-entity, a service provider. You didn't just humiliate me, you tried to annihilate me." David let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Annihilate you? Don't be so dramatic. I gave you a life you could only have dreamed of. A beautiful home, a limitless credit card, a place in society. And what did I ask for in return? An heir, a simple transaction. But you, with your romantic notions and your pathetic need for validation, you had to make it into something more. I thought it was something more because you told me it was." Evelyn cried, her voice cracking with the force of her pain. "You told me you loved me. You asked me to marry you. You told me you wanted to build a family with me. Were they all lies, David? Every single one of them?" He shrugged, a casual gesture that was more insulting than any verbal blow. "Words are just tools, Evelyn. I used the ones that were necessary to get what I wanted. I thought you were smarter than this. I thought you understood the arrangement." The casual cruelty of his words stole the air from her lungs. The arrangement. He had seen their entire relationship, their marriage, as a business deal, and she, in her naivete, had mistaken it for love. Jessica, who had been standing silently by a sentinel guarding her client, stepped forward. "The arrangement, as you so delicately put it, is over, David," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Evelyn will be leaving with me tonight, and I would advise you not to try and stop her." David's eyes narrowed into slits. "She's not going anywhere. She's carrying my child, my heir. She will stay here under my roof, where I can ensure the well-being of my son." "Your son?" Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a newfound strength. "This is my child, David. I am the one carrying him, nurturing him. I am the one whose body is changing, whose heart is beating for two. You may have provided the seed, but I am the one growing the flower, and you will not take him from me." A tense silence filled the air, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. The battle lines had been drawn. This was no longer just about a broken heart. It was about the life of an unborn child. Jessica, ever the strategist, knew that they needed to leave, and they needed to leave now. The longer they stayed, the more opportunity David would have to intimidate and manipulate Evelyn. "We're leaving, Evelyn," she said, her voice firm. She helped Evelyn to her feet, her touch a grounding force in the swirling chaos of Evelyn's emotions. David took a step forward, his face a mask of rage. "I'm warning you, Jessica. Don't interfere in my family's affairs. This stopped being a family affair the moment you declared your wife a surrogate," Jessica retorted, her voice unwavering. "Now it's a legal affair, and I am more than happy to interfere." She guided Evelyn towards the house, her hand a protective shield on the small of her back. David watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burning with an impotent fury. He was a man who was used to getting his way, a man who believed that his wealth could buy him anything, including a wife and a child. But he was about to learn a harsh lesson. Some things were not for sale. As they walked through the silent, cavernous house, Evelyn's eyes fell on the nursery, the one room she had poured all her love and hope into. The soft, gender-neutral colors, the hand-painted mural of whimsical animals, the crib that stood waiting for its precious occupant. It was all a monument to a future that would never be. A fresh wave of grief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Jessica, sensing her distress, squeezed her arm gently. "Don't look back, Evelyn," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There's nothing for you here anymore. We're going forward." They walked out of the house and into the cool night air, leaving behind the wreckage of a shattered fairy tale. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with legal battles and emotional turmoil. But as Evelyn got into Jessica's car, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. She had been living in a gilded cage, and now the door was finally open. The storm was coming, but for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of the rain. She was ready to face it head-on. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would do whatever it took to protect her child and build a new life for them, a life based on truth, not lies, on love, not transactions. The war had just begun, but Evelyn Hollander was no longer a casualty. She was a warrior. The days that followed the disastrous baby shower blurred into a haze of legal consultations, tearful phone calls, and sleepless nights. Evelyn, now ensconced in a secure, upscale hotel suite that Jessica had arranged, felt as though she were navigating a foreign country without a map. The opulent surroundings were a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within her. Every waking moment was a battle against the crushing weight of David's betrayal and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. Jessica Russo, however, was in her element. The courtroom was her battlefield, and the law was her weapon. She moved with a swift and calculated efficiency, a whirlwind of legal motions, injunctions, and discovery requests. Her first move was to file for a temporary restraining order against David, citing his verbal abuse and threatening behavior at the baby shower. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for protecting victims of domestic abuse, granted it without hesitation. David was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Evelyn, a small but significant victory that gave Evelyn a much-needed breathing space. David, predictably, was incandescent with rage. He had built an empire on his ability to intimidate and control, and he could not fathom that he was now being dictated to by the very legal system he had always believed was a tool for the powerful. He hired a team of high-powered, ruthless lawyers from a top-tier Los Angeles firm, men who were known for their scorched-earth tactics and their willingness to bend the law to its breaking point. The legal battle that ensued was brutal and relentless. David's lawyers painted Evelyn as a gold-digging opportunist, a manipulative woman who had entrapped their wealthy client with a calculated pregnancy. They filed motion after motion, trying to drown Jessica in a sea of paperwork, hoping to exhaust her resources and her client's resolve. But they had underestimated Jessica. She was a pit bull in a designer suit, a tireless advocate for her client. She countered every one of their motions with a meticulously researched, brilliantly argued response. She worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a fierce sense of justice. She saw in Evelyn not just a client, but a woman who had been systematically broken down by a narcissistic, controlling man. And she was determined to see her get the justice she deserved. The discovery process, the legal phase, where both sides are required to exchange information and evidence, was where the tide began to turn. Jessica's request for David's financial records, his emails and his text messages, was met with a storm of objections from his legal team. They claimed it was a fishing expedition, a violation of his privacy. But Jessica argued with a fiery eloquence that left the judge in no doubt that it was essential to proving David's true intentions and the nature of his and Evelyn's relationship. The judge agreed, and the floodgates opened. What Jessica and her team uncovered was a treasure trove of damning evidence. There were emails to his lawyers, dating back to before he had even proposed to Evelyn, in which he discussed the legalities of surrogacy and the best way to secure his parental rights without giving the carrier any claim to his fortune. There were text messages to his friends in which he boasted about finding the perfect incubator for his heir, a beautiful, intelligent woman with good genes who was naive enough to believe his declarations of love. But the most damning piece of evidence was a draft of a contract, a document that had never been signed, but which laid out in cold clinical detail the terms of the arrangement. It specified a one-time payment to Evelyn upon the successful delivery of a healthy male heir and a complete relinquishment of her parental rights. It was a cold, cruel document that stripped away any pretense of love or marriage and revealed the stark, ugly truth of David's intentions. Armed with this mountain of evidence, Jessica knew she had the upper hand, but she also knew that a courtroom battle would be long, expensive, and emotionally draining for Evelyn. She decided to try a different tactic. She leaked the draft of the contract to a well-respected investigative journalist from a major national newspaper. The story, when it broke, was a bombshell. The headline, "Millionaire mogul's surrogate wife, the contract he never wanted you to see," went viral within hours. The article, which included excerpts from the contract and David's own incriminating emails, painted a portrait of a man so consumed by his own ego and his desire for a legacy that he was willing to manipulate and deceive the woman he claimed to love. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. David, the self-made tech guru, the charismatic innovator, was now seen as a monster, a cold, calculating narcissist who treated women as disposable commodities. His company's stock plummeted. His board of directors, facing pressure from shareholders and the public, called for an emergency meeting. The carefully constructed empire he had built on a foundation of charm and ruthlessness began to crumble. For Evelyn, the public unmasking of her husband was both a vindication and a fresh source of pain. It was a relief to have the world finally see the man she had been living with, the man who had tormented her in private. But it was also a painful reminder of her own naivete, her own willingness to believe in a fairy tale that had been a lie from the very beginning. But through it all, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. The support that poured in from strangers, the messages from women who had been in similar situations, the quiet, unwavering presence of Jessica, it all combined to form a shield around her heart. She began to see that she was not alone, that her story was not just her own, but the story of countless women who had been silenced and diminished by powerful men. The legal battle was far from over, but the tide had turned decisively in her favor. David, once the king in his castle, was now a pariah, his reputation in tatters, his empire on the brink of collapse. He had tried to erase Evelyn, to reduce her to a footnote in his own grand narrative. But in doing so, he had unwittingly unleashed a force he could not control. He had turned a victim into a warrior, a surrogate into a symbol of defiance. And Evelyn Hollander, with her unborn child as her witness, was just beginning to fight. The public relations firestorm that engulfed David Hollander was unlike anything the Los Angeles elite had ever witnessed. It was a swift and brutal immolation, fueled by the oxygen of social media and the insatiable public appetite for the downfall of the rich and powerful. The man who had once graced the covers of business magazines was now a late-night talk show punchline, a meme, a cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of the city's most exclusive clubs. His board of directors, a collection of stony-faced men and women who valued profit above all else, acted with a swift and merciless precision. In a terse, one-paragraph press release, they announced that David Hollander had been removed as CEO of the company he had founded, citing a loss of confidence in his leadership. His face, once the very symbol of his brand, was now a liability. The financial fallout was catastrophic. Investors fled, partnerships were dissolved, and the company's stock, once a darling of Wall Street, was in free fall. David's personal fortune, a vast and sprawling empire of stocks, real estate, and luxury assets, began to shrink at an alarming rate. He was a king, watching his kingdom burn to the ground, and the architect of his demise was the woman he had so carelessly tried to discard. But David Hollander was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. Cornered and humiliated, he became even more dangerous. His high-priced lawyers, now in damage control mode, advised him to settle to cut his losses and disappear from the public eye. But David, in his hubris, refused. He was convinced that he could still win, that he could crush Evelyn and reclaim his throne. He launched a vicious smear campaign against her, leaking fabricated stories to tabloid websites, painting her as mentally unstable, a promiscuous gold digger who was trying to extort him. He paid for online trolls to attack her on social media, flooding her accounts with vile misogynistic messages. He was determined to break her, to silence her by any means necessary. Evelyn, protected from the worst of the online vitriol by Jessica, and a small, loyal circle of friends, refused to be cowed. The attacks meant to weaken her only strengthened her resolve. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her child, for every woman who had ever been gaslighted, manipulated, and abused by a man like David. The legal battle escalated, the courtroom becoming the final arena for their personal war. David's lawyers, following his scorched earth instructions, pulled out all the stops. They subpoenaed Evelyn's friends, her family, her former colleagues, hoping to dig up some dirt, some past indiscretion they could use to discredit her. They subjected her to a grueling hours-long deposition, their questions designed to humiliate and intimidate her. But Evelyn, coached by Jessica, remained calm and composed. She answered their questions with a quiet dignity, her testimony a powerful and moving account of her life with David, of the subtle, insidious ways he had controlled and diminished her. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply told her truth, and in the sterile, impersonal setting of the deposition room, her truth was a devastating indictment of the man who sat across from her, his face a mask of simmering rage. The turning point in the case, the final fatal twist of the knife, came from an unexpected source. Jessica, in her relentless pursuit of justice, had hired a private investigator to dig into David's past, to uncover the secrets he had buried on his ascent to the top. And what the investigator found was a skeleton in David's closet, so shocking, so damning, that it would not only end his legal battle, but would also threaten to put him behind bars. Years before he had met Evelyn, David had been involved in a similar relationship with another woman, a young, ambitious software engineer who had worked at his company. Her name was Sarah Chen. Like Evelyn, she had been swept off her feet by his charm and his power. Like Evelyn, she had become pregnant. And like Evelyn, she had been subjected to his controlling, manipulative behavior. But Sarah's story did not have a happy ending. When she had refused to have an abortion, David had fired her from her job, citing a fabricated performance issue. He had then used his wealth and his influence to blacklist her from the tech industry, effectively destroying her career. Alone, pregnant, and with no resources, she had fallen into a deep depression. A few months after her son was born, she had taken her own life. The private investigator found Sarah's sister, a quiet, unassuming schoolteacher who had been haunted for years by her sister's death. She had always suspected that David Hollander was responsible, but she had been too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by his power. But now, armed with the knowledge of what he had done to Evelyn, she was ready to tell her story. Jessica arranged for a meeting, and Evelyn listened, her heart breaking, as Sarah's sister recounted the tragic tale of a brilliant, vibrant woman who had been destroyed by David's cruelty. She showed them letters Sarah had written, letters filled with a desperate, heartbreaking love for the man who was slowly crushing her spirit. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable evidence of a pattern of predatory behavior. Jessica immediately filed a motion to introduce Sarah Chen's story into the legal proceedings, arguing that it was essential to establishing David's character and his history of manipulating and abusing women. David's lawyers fought it tooth and nail, but the judge, presented with the overwhelming evidence, allowed it. The prospect of having his darkest secret exposed in open court, of having to face the family of the woman he had driven to her death, was too much even for David Hollander to bear. His bravado finally crumbled, his arrogance replaced by a primal fear. He was no longer a king or a mogul or a master of the universe. He was just a small, pathetic man, exposed and alone, his crimes laid bare for all the world to see. The day before the trial was set to begin, his lawyers called Jessica. He was ready to settle. He was ready to give Evelyn everything she wanted. The settlement was swift and comprehensive. Evelyn would receive a substantial financial settlement, enough to ensure that she and her child would be financially secure for the rest of their lives. She would have sole, legal, and physical custody of their son. David would have no parental rights, no say in his upbringing. His name would not even be on the birth certificate. It was a total and complete victory. But for Evelyn, it was not about the money. It was about the justice. It was about the fact that she had fought a monster and won. She had stood up to a man who had tried to erase her, and she had emerged not unscathed, but whole. A few weeks later, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Ethan, a name that meant strong and enduring. As she held him in her arms for the first time, she looked down at his tiny, perfect face, and she knew that all the pain, all the heartache, all the fear had been worth it. She had not just saved herself, she had saved him. She had broken the cycle of abuse, and she had given her son the one thing David Hollander could never have given him, a future free from the shadow of his father's darkness. The storm was finally over, and in the quiet aftermath, a new life, a new beginning, was ready to blossom. The media frenzy, which had reached a fever pitch during the legal battle, slowly began to subside. The world, with its short attention span, moved on to the next scandal, the next fallen idol. David Hollander, once a titan of industry, became a footnote, a ghost who haunted the lavish mansions and exclusive clubs he had once dominated. He disappeared from public life, a self-imposed exile in some remote, sun-drenched corner of the world. His fortune decimated his reputation in ruins. For Evelyn, the silence was a balm to her wounded soul. She had been living in the eye of a hurricane for so long that the quiet calm of her new life felt like a miracle. She had used a portion of the settlement to buy a charming, sun-drenched house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood far from the glitz and glamour of Beverly Hills. It was a house with a garden, a place where she could plant flowers and watch them grow, a place where her son could run and play in the soft, green grass. Her days were no longer filled with legal consultations and strategic planning sessions. They were filled with the simple, profound joys of motherhood, the warmth of her son's body against hers, the sound of his laughter, the sweet, milky scent of his skin. She named him Liam, a name that meant strong-willed warrior and protector. It was a name that embodied the spirit she hoped to nurture in him, the spirit she had discovered within herself. She reconnected with her old friends, the ones from her pre-David life, the ones who had known her as an art curator, a woman with a passion for beauty and a quiet strength. They welcomed her back with open arms, their love and support, a comforting anchor in the sometimes overwhelming sea of new motherhood. They brought her home-cooked meals. They babysat Liam so she could have a few hours to herself. They listened without judgment as she slowly, cautiously began to unpack the trauma of the past year. Jessica Russo remained a constant presence in her life, her role evolving from that of a legal gladiator to that of a trusted friend. They would meet for coffee, their conversations now revolving around sleep schedules and teething rings rather than legal briefs and court dates. Jessica, who had seen the worst of humanity in her line of work, found in Evelyn a source of inspiration, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in Evelyn's garden, watching Liam take his first wobbly steps on the soft grass, Jessica handed Evelyn a small, elegantly wrapped gift. Evelyn opened it to find a single, beautifully framed photograph. It was a picture of her from the baby shower, taken just moments before David's devastating speech. In it, she was radiant, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes filled with a soft, hopeful light. "I know it might be painful to look at, Jessica," said her voice gentle, "but I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to remember the woman you were in that moment. The woman who was about to have her world torn apart, but who had no idea how strong she was about to become." Evelyn looked at the photograph, and for the first time, she did not feel the sting of betrayal or the shame of her own naivete. She felt a profound sense of compassion for the woman in the picture, for the innocent, hopeful person who had believed in a fairy tale. She had been through a fire that should have consumed her, but she had emerged from the ashes stronger, wiser, and more herself than she had ever been. She had lost a life of unimaginable luxury, a life that had been the envy of millions. But she had gained something far more precious, her freedom, her voice, her self-worth. She was no longer defined by a man or by his wealth or by the gilded cage he had built for her. She was a mother, a friend, a survivor. She was Evelyn Hollander, and she was finally, gloriously free. Her story, which had once been a source of public shame and private agony, had become a source of strength and inspiration for others. She received letters and emails from women all over the world, women who had seen in her story a reflection of their own struggles, women who had found in her courage the inspiration to leave their own abusive situations. And so Evelyn, the woman who had once been silenced, found her voice. She began to work with a local women's shelter, sharing her story, offering support and encouragement to women who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping domestic abuse. She discovered a new sense of purpose, a new passion. She had once curated art, but now she was helping to curate lives to help women find the beauty and the strength that lay within them, waiting to be discovered. The road ahead was still long, and the scars of her past would always be a part of her story. But they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of the battles she had fought and won, the testament to the warrior she had become. As she sat in her garden, with the warmth of the sun on her face and the sound of her son's laughter in her ears, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the best was yet to come. The fairy tale was over, but her real life, a life of purpose, of love, of quiet, unshakable strength, had just begun. Evelyn's story is a raw and powerful testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit. It's a story that reminds us that even in the face of the most calculated cruelty and public humiliation, we have the power to rise from the ashes, to reclaim our narrative, and to build a life of our own choosing. She was publicly shamed, stripped of her dignity, and cast aside by the man who was supposed to love and protect her. But she refused to be a victim. She fought back, not just for herself, but for her unborn child and for every person who has ever been made to feel small and powerless. If this story of resilience, justice, and the incredible power of a woman's spirit resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the extraordinary strength that lies within us all. Thank you for listening.